Hello, this is the first lecture of the endocrine system for Anatomy and Physiology 1 for students taking this course with Gina Piscatelli. There's two parts to this lecture. The first part is the general structure and function of the endocrine system. The second part will talk about the types of hormones that the endocrine system uses and their characteristics. For further information, please refer to your reading assignment in the textbook and your study questions. So part 1, the general structure and function of the endocrine system. Like the nervous system, the endocrine system's function is to regulate other organ systems. It does so by a different means, however. The nervous system uses neural impulses, or nerve impulses, that are very quick. The endocrine system, by contrast, uses hormones. So hormones will be released by an endocrine cell, and the hormone will travel in the bloodstream to target cells. This is a much slower process. So the structures that belong to the endocrine system include endocrine glands, but also some tissues and cells found throughout the body that also secrete hormones but wouldn't be necessarily considered a gland. So first, let's review what the definition of a hormone is. A hormone is a signaling molecule that travels in the bloodstream to target cells, and once it reaches the target cells, stimulates a response in the target cells. Now recall that target cells can only respond to some sort of chemical stimulus if they have a receptor for that chemical stimulus. So the cell on the left, the secreting cell here, releases the chemical signal, a hormone, into the blood. It travels quite a distance, and many cells see this signal because the signal can leave the bloodstream in various locations. But the only cells that will be responding to that particular molecule, that hormone, will be cells that have a receptor specific for that hormone. So the major organs of the endocrine system include the thyroid gland, and on the back side of the thyroid gland, here's the thyroid gland, on the back side of the thyroid gland are 4 little glands called parathyroid glands. They do have very different functions. We'll talk about those later. Then a little bit inferior to the thyroid gland is the thymus gland. That's important in immune system function. And then the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidney, the pancreas, which is below the stomach, not shown here. And then we even have some glands in the brain. The hypothalamus makes hormones that enter the bloodstream. The pineal gland, remember, makes melatonin that enters the bloodstream. And then the pituitary gland, whether you consider it part of the brain or nervous system or part of the endocrine system, also releases hormones into the blood, as do the testes and the ovaries. So lots of sources. So recall that all the glands that I just mentioned are ductless. There's no duct, even though we know of glands, particularly in the skin, that do have ducts. Those are exocrine glands. What exocrine glands secrete will enter a duct instead of the bloodstream. An endocrine gland, as I mentioned many times already, will release a hormone that enters the bloodstream. So besides glands, there are other sources of hormones. The heart even releases a hormone, helping with blood pressure. The small intestine releases some hormones that end up affecting the stomach. Bones release hormones, adipose tissue, stomach, liver, kidney, skin, placenta. So there's any cell that releases a chemical signaling molecule that enters the bloodstream could technically be called an endocrine cell. But the majority of the endocrine system that we think of really is composed of glands that usually have a specific function in releasing hormones, with the exception of the ovaries and testes, because the ovaries and testes, of course, have another function, and that is to produce gametes, that is, eggs and sperm. So let's look at how hormones are released. What causes a hormone to be released? There are three different ways that an release of a hormone would be stimulated. Either there's something in the blood, a certain parameter in the blood, we call this a humoral stimulus, or a neural stimulus, maybe the nervous system does, or maybe another hormone does. So as an example for a humoral stimulus, maybe there's an altered level of a certain ion or nutrient like glucose that will stimulate an endocrine gland to release a hormone. A neural stimulus would be that a neuron would innervate a gland, and the neuron conducts an impulse and the gland responds by making a hormone. There are also hormones that we call releasing and inhibiting hormones that endocrine glands release, but those hormones act on another endocrine gland. So we're going to look at examples of all of these. So first, a humoral stimulus as an example. So one hormone that is released due to a humoral stimulus is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid glands, which are located on the back or posterior side of the thyroid gland. And what triggers the release of parathyroid hormone is a low calcium level in the blood, so hypocalcemia. There are blood vessels that are located around these parathyroid glands, and they can detect low calcium, and in response they secrete the hormone they make, which is PTH, or parathyroid hormone. Now we expect that that's going to then increase calcium levels, and that is the ultimate result. The ultimate result is that target cells will have actions that end up increasing the calcium blood level. The target cells are in bone, the intestine, and the kidney. And what bone does is resorbs calcium from the bone and puts it into the blood. The intestine absorbs dietary calcium, and the kidney will reabsorb calcium from the fluid in the kidney tubules, thereby having the body keep the calcium instead of it being eliminated with the urine. Here's an example of a neural stimulus that causes hormone release by the adrenal medulla. So the hormone that the adrenal medulla releases is epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline if you like. And on the left is a picture of the adrenal gland, with the medulla being the very center part. So this is a neural stimulus, and it's the sympathetic nervous system that innervates this gland. So what has to happen is that the preganglionic sympathetic neuron has to conduct an impulse to the adrenal medulla. When the adrenal medulla is stimulated by this nerve impulse or neural impulse, the cells release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, just like the rest of the sympathetic response, the action of epinephrine will cause the heart rate to go up, the pupil to dilate, the airways to dilate. Those are the actions of the sympathetic nervous system. The advantage to having the adrenal medulla release a hormone is that this hormone then is going to be traveling in the bloodstream and reach many different target cells. The result is a prolonged response, and the body will be prepared for increased activity for a longer period of time. There's also a mechanism in place to release hormones based on other hormonal stimuli. This is the case with thyroid hormone, cortisol, and testosterone. So thyroid hormone is made by the thyroid gland, and that's kind of outlined here. Cortisol is made by the adrenal gland, but just the cortex. That's how it gets its name, cortisol. And testosterone is produced by the testes. So they each have different hormonal stimuli. One hormone doesn't stimulate all these different endocrine organs. Instead, there are 3 different hormones that do so. They all, however, come from the anterior pituitary gland. So the one that stimulates the thyroid gland is called thyroid stimulating hormone. The one that stimulates the adrenal cortex is called adrenocortical hormone, or ACTH for short. And the one that stimulates the testes is called luteinizing hormone, or LH. And of course the response is what we're looking at is hormone stimulation. So in response, the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone, the adrenal cortex releases cortisol, the testes releases testosterone. Now the release of hormone is not only stimulated, but it can also be inhibited. And one example of how hormone release is inhibited is through a process that involves the blood level of the hormone. So negative feedback inhibition is used. We've seen negative feedback inhibition before with the nervous system, but now what we're looking at is the level of a hormone present in the bloodstream determining whether or not more of it will be released. Okay, so if it gets too high, we want to stop its release. If it gets too low, then we need its release to be stimulated. So the way this negative feedback works with thyroid hormone anyway, is that normally we see that the hypothalamus releases a hormone known as thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. And that causes the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which we've already seen. Thyroid stimulating hormone, now traveling in the blood, reaches the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland in response releases thyroid hormone. As long as adequate levels of TSH are around, thyroid hormone will be continually released. But once thyroid hormone levels get really high, it's traveling in the bloodstream. The thyroid gland, the anterior pituitary, and the hypothalamus all have a blood supply, and so they see this high level of thyroid hormone. That causes inhibition. That's what this negative symbol is. That's what this number 3 here is. That causes inhibition of TRH and TSH secretion. Ultimately, if you stop TRH production and that stops TSH production, thyroid hormone will go down in the blood. So that's negative feedback inhibition. Okay, let's do part 2 of the endocrine system now. Part 2 involves different types of hormones and their characteristics. There are 2 different general chemical types of hormones, chemical structures. Some hormones are amino acid based, think protein, and some of them are steroids, lipids. So examples of amino acid-based hormones would include the epinephrine and norepinephrine that we've already talked about. Thyroid hormone we've talked about. I haven't mentioned some of these others, but insulin is one that you're probably familiar with. There's a long list of amino acid-based hormones. But there are also steroid hormones in the body. For example, calcitriol, which is going to be involved with blood calcium levels, cortisol, which we've already looked at, made by the adrenal cortex, and of course estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. Those are all steroids derived from cholesterol. So it's probably easier to remember the steroid hormones than it is to remember the long list of amino acid-based hormones. So one clue on how to do this is that most steroids, not all, but most steroids, the names end in ONE or OL. And truthfully, even estrogen does, because another name for that is, I should just type it, is estradiol. I can't do it. Okay. Now the reason we study whether or not a hormone is amino acid based or steroid based is because they will then have different characteristics. An amino acid based hormone, for example, would be hydrophilic. Amino acids and water get along really well. Steroids are hydrophobic. They're lipid based, so steroids and water do not get along well. Some examples, of course, as I've mentioned before, would be epinephrine. Here's the structure of epinephrine. You don't have to memorize that, but there's amine groups, for example, OHs, right? And so that's going to react really well with the polar nature of water. Okay. But steroids don't. They're mainly based on carbon and hydrogen bonds, which are characteristically hydrophobic. This will make a difference in how they're transported in the blood, because the plasma of the blood is water-based. So let's look at how hormones are transported in the blood. Hormones that are hydrophilic can be freely suspended in the blood. They're just floating around in the plasma. Except one, and that's thyroid hormone. Even though thyroid hormone is a protein or amino acid based hormone, it needs a transport protein to stay suspended in the bloodstream. Otherwise, it will clump up. Okay. So hydrophobic hormones are those that do need transport proteins, like thyroid hormone does. It allows them to be completely suspended in the plasma, and it protects the hormone from being degraded. Some examples of proteins that help these hormones be transported in the blood are plasma albumin and plasma globulins. These are made by the liver. So peptide hormones can be freely suspended on their own, but steroid hormones and thyroid hormone need a transport protein. Another difference between hydrophilic and hydrophobic hormones will be where their receptors are located in target cells. So amino acid-based hormones are hydrophilic. That means, though, that they cannot get across the cell membrane. So they will have to use a cell membrane receptor on the target cell. However, steroid hormones can slip through a lipid bilayer, a phospholipid bilayer, I guess, and therefore reach intracellular receptors. Now, the actions will also differ between amino acid-based and steroid hormones. There's two general categories of actions that all hormones have on target cells. They're big categories. One is that they could regulate the transcription of genes, kind of what you would say turn on or turn off genes. The other, and that should be a number 2, is that a hormone can activate certain intracellular enzymes inside of a cell, usually by activating second messengers. So it's not the hormone itself that does the action, it's something that it triggers inside the cell. Some hormones even do both. It's kind of a combination, but that gets too complex. So if you think about it, you can predict which type of hormone will actually be able to cause transcription of a gene. It has to be a hormone that is hydrophobic, that can get across the cell membrane, bind to a receptor on the inside, because that's where the genes are located. Versus those hormones that activate a second messenger that's inside the cell, they won't be able to get to the inside of the cell. That's why a second messenger is needed. So they bind to a receptor on the cell surface, and that's going to trigger production of a second messenger. So we're going to look at an example of each of these. So first, steroid hormones and thyroid hormone both behave, both have the effect of regulating gene transcription. And that makes sense because they both need transport proteins in the plasma, and they both can bind to receptors inside the cell. So steroid hormone moves into the cell, binds to its receptor, and then this complex enters the nucleus, the hormone and receptor complex, which typically binds to a portion of the DNA that regulates a gene that's upstream. That might turn on the gene or it might turn off the gene, which means if it's turned on, you'll get transcription and RNA will be made. If it's turned off, then no transcription will be made. Okay, so that will be no messenger RNA. Now, the ultimate effect inside the target cell, besides turning on or off the gene, will really vary depending on what the function of that gene is. Okay, it depends on what gene was transcribed and therefore what protein is made during translation. So the ultimate effect varies. Now let's talk a bit about how second messengers are derived with amino acid-based hormones binding to a cell surface receptor. So again, this hormone can't get inside the target cell. Instead, it has to trigger activation or formation of a second messenger. The most common second messengers that get produced inside of a cell are cyclic AMP or calcium. So the first step is that the hormone binds to a receptor on the membrane, and this receptor is associated with a G protein, so we call it a G protein linked receptor. Binding of the hormone activates the G protein. The G protein then activates a neighboring enzyme. In this example, I'm showing the enzyme adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase produces cyclic AMP from ATP, which is already inside the cell. So we have our second messenger, cyclic AMP. That is what is made inside the cell. We started with a hormone, that's our first messenger, And now we have cyclic AMP, which will be continually produced, many molecules of it, as long as the hormone is bound to that receptor. Now, the cyclic AMP, what does it do? Well, it depends on what target cell we're in, okay? Usually it activates enzymes inside target cells, and that can stimulate lots of chemical reactions. Maybe the target cell will then secrete something, or maybe channels will open, like ion channels. It depends on what target cell you're in. Here's one example that's a little bit more concrete for the G protein linked receptors that amino acid based hormones use. And we're going to use the hormone epinephrine. Okay, so epinephrine is an amino acid based hormone. It binds to a cell surface receptor because it can't get across the membrane. That cell surface receptor is linked to a G protein. Now that G protein is activated, and in turn it activates a neighboring enzyme, adenylyl cyclase, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. We now have a molecule inside the cell that can act as a messenger. It activates protein kinase A, which certainly don't have to memorize. Okay, but what does that do? So we've increased the production of enzymes. Well, this particular enzyme in a liver cell will inhibit the synthesis of glycogen, but it will promote the breakdown of glycogen. So when it promotes the breakdown of glycogen, you get an increase in glucose. And we know that, like with the sympathetic neural response, we need extra glucose around to help prepare the body for fight or flight. So that's what the epinephrine hormone does as well. Okay, now hormones' effects vary, like how fast the effect takes place and how long. So some hormones act pretty quickly on the target cell, but others take time to have an effect on the target cell. We do know that it's never as quick as the nervous system. But even amongst different hormones, there's a variation in how quickly the target cell can respond. And that's because different hormones, of course, behave differently. Like steroid hormones, they're all about promoting gene transcription, and then protein synthesis has to take place, and then whatever that protein does inside the target cell has to take place. So it can take some time. So the longest for steroid hormones. Now, how long does the effect last? Longer than the nervous system. So shortest for protein-based or amino acid-based hormones. But if you think about the fact that a gene has been turned on by a steroid hormone and proteins are being made, then that will probably likely last for hours. So it depends on the receptor mechanism, meaning are we using G protein linked receptors or an intracellular receptor? Are we using a steroid hormone or an amino acid based hormone? So those things vary. But another thing is how fast is the hormone cleared from the blood? So the kidneys have to clear the hormone from the blood, they always do. And it depends on how long that takes. And also hormone structure can break down. So there's a certain half-life of every hormone in the blood. So it really varies. Generally speaking, steroid hormone onset, longest duration, also longest for steroid hormones. But any hormone has a longer lasting effect, but takes longer to see a result than the nervous system. So let's just look at some review questions briefly to see if this makes sense to you. So there are 3 hormones that are involved in helping the liver keep our proper blood glucose level. And the liver can do two things to do this, to keep blood glucose levels normal. It can either synthesize glycogen or it can break down glycogen. So the three hormones that affect the liver are insulin, glucagon, and cortisol. My question is much more simple than relating to glycogen, and that is, how many receptors does a liver cell need to respond to all three of these hormones? Would one receptor work and the liver would respond to either insulin, glucagon, or cortisol with that same receptor? Or would there be two, maybe, or three? And I'm hoping you said three, because that's the right answer. Okay, let's look at the second review question. Which system can change the heart rate more quickly? Somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system by release of acetylcholine, autonomic nervous system by release of epinephrine, or the endocrine system? Well, if you remember, the somatic nervous system doesn't innervate cardiac muscle. So that can't be true. So A is not a possibility. And then as far as hormones versus the nervous system go, we know that hormones take the longest. So D is not an option. And now we look at the autonomic nervous system. Now the word epinephrine is probably a giveaway because that will probably increase the heart rate the quickest, but either one of these would be true. We know the parasympathetic nervous system can change heart rate, and we know the sympathetic nervous system can change heart rate by epinephrine. So if I asked you which system increases the heart rate more quickly, the answer would be C. If I said which system decreases the heart rate more quickly, that would be B. Okay, let's look at number 3. Receptors for steroid hormones are commonly located either inside the target cell, on the plasma membrane of the target cell, in blood plasma, that's different, or in the extracellular fluid. Well, those are just silly, right? So steroid hormones, the receptor is always in the target cell. And then I have another set of questions that I'll let you go over on your own, and you can look at the answers in the slides at the bottom in the notes section. Thank you.